Hey guys, welcome back. In the previous videos, we covered four different kind of triggers to run our tests. One was to trigger our test, on a merge to main. Another one was on a pull request. Then we saw how we could trigger tests manually, and we also saw how we could run our test on a cron job on a schedule. Today we are going to cover something very interesting and also a very practical scenario. And to explain that, maybe let's open Paint and I will draw some pictures. So let me open Microsoft Paint. In a typical project, let's say if you're working with bunch of microservices, you might have a couple of microservices. So let's say a microservice for address, for payment, for documents, for employees. So let me just quickly put some names in them. So maybe you have an employee service, and let's say you have a address service, and imagine you have a payment service. What's wrong with service today? I'm typing it every time wrong. And imagine if you have a document service, right? And imagine that this particular application is hosted on like is available both as a browser version, both as a mobile version, and you might also have bunch of microservices. So maybe you created three different kind of test frameworks, maybe one for APIs, one for mobile, and one for browser. So let's just call them as API tests. You can have your mobile tests, and maybe you have your browser tests. And by the way, I expect this video to be a little bit longer, because there are too many moving parts here. And we're going to use GitHub Actions to demonstrate this. But once you understand the concept, I'm pretty sure you'll be able to implement it in any other kind of CI provider. So in this particular case, we have three test repositories. We have a bunch of microservices, like I've only put 4 here, but maybe you have 10, 15, 20, whatever. It does not matter. And in many companies, they follow a Git flow kind of an approach, but it doesn't matter. Like if your company is following Git flow or a trunk-based development, depending on that, you might have different long-lived branches. So in a typical Git flow structure, you might have a develop branch as a long-lived environment, and you might have a staging environment as a long-lived environment, right? And of course, you can have a main branch, which could be typically a production environment branch. But for now, for testing purposes, these two branches are important for us, right? And what happens is in a Git flow kind of structure, like people create pull request against the develop branch, and every time a pull request is merged into develop, the develop should be deployed, right? And for a testing perspective, a scenario could be that we want to run like all our API tests for employee service every time a develop is completed. So basically there are two approaches that can happen. Someone might say what if we can run our test with the pull request on this develop branch, or after the pull request is merged in a develop branch. Now both approaches comes with their own pros and cons. So if you want to run, let's say, your API test or mobile test or browser test on the pull request on this employee service, then there would also be a dependency on other services, and the question would be, how would you set it up? So there are ways in which those can be set up, but the cost is CPU and infrastructure. So like in one of my past projects, we tried to run our API test and mobile test as a part of pull request, and because there were too many pull requests coming up, and because you have to set up that state for all those pull requests, the infrastructure was getting capped out. And that's the reason we were requested not to run our test on the pull request, which now I understand, like it's a practical approach. So another approach that you can do is, instead of running a test on pull request, Once the pull request is merged into develop, then the develop environment will be deployed, and then to run those tests on those environments. And the good thing is, in this particular case, you don't have to create different temporary profile environments for each pull request. So it saves a huge amount of CPU time, and of course the consequences. Now you are catching the breaking changes after the fact and not before the fact, right? But it can be done, like I said, based on whatever way your company wants to go. It can be done either on merge or develop, or on PR, or on staging. In this particular use case, we're going to use a trigger as when something is merged into develop or staging in a microservice, right? And then what you want to do is, like, when something is merged into develop, we actually want to run our test on the develop environment to see if the latest change has broken something in our application. So not on staging, on develop. And every time a PR is merged from develop to staging, then we want to run our test on the staging environment and not on the develop environment. So we want that kind of flexibility, right? And instead of running like all the tests, we can actually target our tests only for that particular service. And we can probably run all our tests on a schedule. So this is, again, these are just like some efficiency tips. But of course, if you want to like run all the tests, you can run all the tests. So the scenario that we're aiming for is something gets merged into a develop branch or into a staging branch. We run the test for all different trigger tests into all different repositories for that particular service, right? That's what we want to do here. So this is the use case that we're trying to achieve in this particular video, right? I hope it's clear. Now to do this, let's go ahead and do something. Let's create a bunch of repositories. So in this particular example, I mentioned about employee service, address service, payment service. So let's just create two services, and these would be dummy services because, well, the only goal is to show that when a new pull request is created on develop or merged into develop, that's the time we want to run our test. So let's create an employee service and a payment service. So let's go back, and I will create two repositories. New repository. So imagine this is your company, and they are having these two microservices. One is an employee service and this is a dummy microservice to trigger test on downstream job. Okay. Let's add a README file, and we will only tamper with the README file to create some pull requests and trigger our test. So let's create a repository, and let's also create another repository. Maybe open link in new tab, and let's call this as a payment service, right? So this, in a real world scenario, this would be your application's real microservices, and we could probably copy paste the same name. What was it here? Dummy microservice to trigger test on a downstream job, right? So let's put this here, add a README file, create repository, and let's pull the code in our local machine. Copy. Let's go back. Windows 1. Let's, in fact, first let's pull in the code. So let's open a terminal. Let's zoom in a little bit, and I'm going to say change directory to D and git clone and clone this repository, right? Now let's also clone the other repository, which was the employee service repository, right? So let's clone this. Let's open the terminal again, git clone employee service.git, right? So now we have got our two microservices, and now what you want to do is let's open these microservices. File open. So one was payment service, right? So let's open this in a new window. And at this moment, this service contains nothing. It only contains a README file, right? So let's change that. And in fact, we can So let's go back and maybe let's also add a workflow file to it, right? And what we want to do is in this particular case, so let me go back. We want to have two workflow files in each of these microservices. So typically what happens is for deployment of each particular environment, there will be a file which will be placed inside each of these microservices. So if I go back, Windows 2, let's go to Actions, and let's create a new workflow file. And I already have created a workflow file for this, because otherwise this video will become extremely lengthy. And I'm going to just copy that particular workflow file here, and I'm going to explain to you like what that workflow file does. So let me remove everything, and I'm pasting the code here. So basically what we want to do is, like as I showed in this picture, every time something gets merged to develop or to staging, we want to deploy our environment, build our environment, and then send an event to run our test on our test services. So if I go back, so what I want to do is, like, on every time something is pushed to a develop branch, we want to run our test. And workflow dispatch allows us to also trigger this workflow manually, right? If you want to test something, the job is we have a so typically, like, there will be a job to deploy the develop environment, right? And I've just given some dummy steps here where the repository will be checked out, the infrastructure will be set up, the application will be built, and then the application will be deployed. And once the application is deployed, then we would like to send a notification event to our downstream jobs, right? And our downstream jobs could be like in this picture. It could be an API test, mobile test, browser test, right? So if I go back, so this could be like multiple repositories. So if you give a strategy as a matrix, for now I have commented this because I don't have multiple test repositories at this moment, but only one repository. So I'm only providing one repository. But if you comment this and if you uncomment this, and let's say if you have multiple test repositories, you can just put them by comma separated names with username, the name of the repositories, and then it will trigger the test into all those repositories, right? So let's go back. And then we're going to use a custom GitHub action called Peter Events Repository Dispatch. If I just search for this and open it, let's do it. If you click on this, it explains what this action does. And for example, you can read all about it. It shows how you can use it. So this is the name of the action. You have to provide a secret personal access token. You have to provide the name of the repository. You have to provide the name of the event, and this is a custom event, so you can give it any name that you want to give. And the client payload would contain the information that you want to pass on to your downstream job, right? So in our case, let's open it again. Where is it? Maybe here. So in our case, what you want to do is the repositories are like, we're taking the strategy as a matrix strategy. At this moment, it's only one, but as I said, you can send the same event to multiple repositories. Token is something that we have to create ourselves, right? So that this event can work. Then you have to give a name of the event type. So this is a custom name that I provide, which is basically deployment completed notification event, right? Because that is what is happening in this particular workflow, that once the deployment is completed, we want to send an event to the downstream job. And the client payload, I've given an example here that it can contain the whole context of this upstream job if you want to use it. In our case, we're only going to use these two fields, like test environment field, which will say on which deployment this is running, and the name of the test. So you can give the name of the test as exactly the same as the repository name, or you can give it something different. I like to give it the same as the repository name. In that case, you can use this variable as GitHub event repository name, right? And let's also rename this file to something more meaningful. So let's call it as deploy to develop, right? Because this will only trigger when something is deployed on the develop environment. And then we want to pass on the test environment as develop, and we want to only run the test which has the same name as employee service, right? So let's make a commit to it. We can commit directly to the main branch, it's no problem. So that's one. And in fact, let's create another one as well. So maybe actions, and let's create a new workflow file and configure. Let's copy the whole thing again, and this time let's call it as something for staging, right? So this time we want to run the test on staging because we want to trigger this on deploy to deploy to staging, right? Okay, so we have deployed to staging, we have deployed to, and of course this is not for branches develop, but this is for staging. This is considering, you know, good much to staging branch. So that's how it should be. Everything else remains the same. This is changed to staging environment. So start commit new file. So deploy to staging, it should be moved back, but no problem, I can do it. So let me first pull in the code. So payment service, not payment, but let's put an employee service, right? Employee service. And typically what we need to do guys is we have to repeat the same process for each of the microservice, right? I'm not going to do it for all the microservices because then this will become extremely lengthy. So I think I can demonstrate with one, and you can replicate the same for other repositories. So let's do a git pull, right? Control C, Control V, git pull. Okay, now it should have pulled all the code. Let's move it to its right place, which is here. Refactor, and let's create a branch called develop branch. So let's call git checkout branch develop, right? Because now you're following a git flow strategy. And switch to a new branch develop, and let's commit the code to develop branch, right? So let's open VS Code. Did something change? Not yet. Why does it not show Windows 1, Windows 2, Windows 1, employee, deploy to staging, deploy, interesting, readme file. Let me just change something in the readme file. Microservice, okay, this is good enough. We fixed the typo. Let's go to Windows 4, file, open folder, and employee service. Yeah, that's the reason it was not showing it, because I have opened a different repository. So now if I go back to Git, I should see two changes. In fact, there are many. Yeah, we're not going to make too many changes here. Let's only focus on the changes that we want to do. So let's add a readme file. Yeah, let's just make it a little bit better. Readme file, and then let's say created develop branch, right? So commit, and let's push this to develop branch. Okay, So now, and if you want, we can even create a Windows 1. We can even employee source. Let's even create a new branch called get checkout branch staging, right? And let's make the change here, and let's call it a reference section. Okay, and let's go back to Windows 4. Now we have something on the main develop branch and something on the staging branch, right? Typically, we have more stuff on develop branch and less stuff on staging branch. So I think if you want to do that, yeah, maybe we should not call it staging branch. Yeah, maybe let's just publish the branch, right? So imagine whatever we have on develop branch, we also have the same stuff on the staging branch, right? And now we want to create a new pull request, which would have more changes on the develop branch. So let's call it as Windows. Let's open this and get branch. So now we have main branch, develop branch, staging branch, and let's check out a branch. Get checkout branch, PR for develop branch, right? And in this PR for develop branch, we can actually add this change, and let's just say updated readme commit. And if I go back, Windows 2, we're not going to create any pull request on this. We're not going to create any pull request on this. Develop has recent pushes 1 minute ago. Refresh. Main develop staging has recent pushes 1 minute ago, but I want to create a new branch. Let's see. Yeah, I've not yet published it, so let's publish this. Okay, and now we should have 3 branches. So let's go back and refresh this. So now we have 3 branches, right? So now we want to compare and create a pull request, and this time the pull request is not on main branch, but we want to do it on the develop branch, right? So we're doing it on the develop branch, and we want to create a pull request. And now, since we have created a pull request on the develop branch, well, so far nothing should happen because our trigger is on, so yeah, this was on merge to main. So our trigger is on develop branch, but what is the problem? One job completed. What does it say? Parameter token or authentication is required. Okay, so let's go ahead and make some changes before you merge the pull request. If you remember, we said we need a repository access token to trigger events, right? So let's just go back. And to create a repository personal access token, what you need to do is you have to go to your settings, and let's call it as, let's go to developer settings. Then you go to personal access tokens. There are 2 options. You have fine-grained tokens and you have classic tokens. I tried to flirt around with fine-grained tokens, but I was not able to, make them work. So for now, I will skip them and I will work with classic tokens. But GitHub recommends to work with fine-grained tokens, right? So maybe I will figure it out in another video, or if you figure it out, do let me know what all things we need to change to make it work. But for now, let's go back to tokens classic. And let's generate a new token, and not a fine grain but a generic token, right? And I'm going to call it as a personal access token. Was this token, or maybe the same name, whatever is in the workflow, and let's give it access on repository, and let's give it access on workflow, and I'm not giving it any other access, and I think this should be fine. And by the way, so this has been already taken. Okay, so let's change this. Let's go back to employee service. Maybe let's just create a new token, right? Let's just call it personal access token. Generate token. And I will remove these access tokens because with access tokens, people can get access to do whatever they want to do in this particular repository, right? So I'm going to delete this pad and we'll still create a new pad so that the stuff will still work, but I'm not going to keep exactly the same token. So I'll copy this and then I'll go back to repository employee service, and let's go back to actions. Let's open this workflow file and I'm going to change this token. First let me rename the token to pad because that's what we are going to use. Start commit directly to the staging branch, or maybe not yet. Let's first go ahead and change the settings. In the settings, inside secrets, inside actions, I can add a new repository secret. I can call it as pad, paste the secret here, add secret, and now I can go back, and now if I commit, now I know that the token exists. So I'll commit directly to the staging branch. Okay, so this was staging branch, but we also need something to change in the develop branch. So let's change something in the develop branch as well. Workflow file, staging, go back, actions. Okay, workflow file, this is the develop branch, and let's also change this to Control Z, PET, start commit changes. So now we changed in both the staging branch and in the develop branch, right? And let's go back and look into our actions. At this moment, we have got one trigger, update deploy to develop, which is on the develop branch. Okay, and I think it's probably coming from the PR. Let's see, dispatch event completed. So this one worked fine. Let's see what it sent in the payload. Let's come down. And it did send the environment information as develop, and it did send the information tag as employee service, right? So this is working fine. Where is the pull request? This is the pull request. Staging, develop as recent pushes. So because you push something on develop, because you push like at this moment, both the changes are on the develop branch. They are not on the staging branch. Let's see. Recent push was 1 minute ago, 2 minutes ago. Develop, staging. Okay. Let's go back. So this is the PR that we have got open, but I'm not going to run it yet because you know that once something was merged into the develop branch, the trigger ran. So what we're going to do is now let's go back to our project, which is 0, and let's create a trigger to receive this particular event. And if we go back and open let's say different GitHub triggers, events that trigger workflow, the trigger that we are interested in is called repository dispatch, right? The way it works is first you have to give the trigger as repository dispatch, then you give the name of the trigger, and then you basically use it as something like this, like job, give the name of the job, whatever we want to use, and then if you use GitHub event.client payload, then you can use the field that is being passed from the upstream job. So let's go back, Windows 1. Let's create a copy of our triggers because we already have our test, we already have our triggers defined. So let's just make a copy of it and Control V. copy, and if we paste, so trigger test on an external event. That's what we want to do now, right? And like we saw, Windows 2, the trigger name is this, like that's how we pass on this trigger name. So let's remove this. This is going to be our trigger name. And if you remember, Windows 2, the name of our workflow file is, so let's go pull request. Let's go to actions. Let's open the develop branch. And if you look in the workflow file, the custom name of our trigger is deployment completed notification event, right? So Windows 1, Windows 1. So the name of our trigger is going to be this. Let's see. Sorry, it has to be inside the brackets, like Control Z, Control Z. So it has to be like this. Okay. We are going to reuse the same workflow, and then we are going to pass the values of our tags to include. The tags of test to include would be the name that is passed on this upstream job, right? And that would be if I go back, yeah, that would be the name of this repository itself. So in this particular case, I think it is employee service, right? And so let's, just to be 100% sure, if we click on this, if you remember, the values that we passed here, let's scroll down, let's scroll down. So the values that we passed were, tag was employee service, right? And the test environment was develop. So these are the two values that we passed. So if I go back, Windows 1, and how do we use it? So if we go back to the same article, it says to be able to use this information, this is how you can use this. So if I give Control C, Windows 1, yep, and I have to provide it like this: GitHub event client payload, and this is not message, but the value that we have passed is tag, right? So the value is tag. Okay, we don't have to provide anything to exclude, because by default if you provide something to include, that's the only test that it would run. Apart from this, we also want to pass on the test environment, right? So we can even copy this, Control C, and let's pass on the this parameter as well. And instead of giving inputs.test environment, we can copy the same thing, and this time we're going to pass the test environment, right? And the way it was specified was, if I come back here, this is the tag name, Windows 1, Windows 1, and now you can see every time something is getting merged into the develop branch or into the staging branch, the same environment name will be passed, the name of the service will be passed using this tag, and we will run exactly the same test for that particular service, right? Now to test our hypothesis, trigger test on schedule, let's see, git branch, let's create a new branch, trigger test on external event. Okay, so we have this branch. Let's also create, like we already can handle the develop and staging part of the test environment. So if we go back to let's say, where is it, reference, here we provide a test environment, so we can deal with environments. So let's go and create two test classes, right? So let's create a new maybe copy class, and let's call it as test employee service. And we can even create test for payment service, right? So refactor, copy class, and this time we call it as payment service. So in one of our test repositories, we have tests for different kind of services, right? And let's remove all these tests. A good idea would be to basically, tag these test cases. So let's also remove these failing and flaky test cases. Maybe one test is good enough, or maybe let's put two test cases, right? Like just to be sure. And in fact, just to demonstrate that, these tests are in fact running on the same test environment, we could provide some information here, about the environment itself. Assert that test for chosen environment runs, and then let's say we can have it as let's call it as config equals and test environment factory get instance get config. Okay, and then we can have a string expected environment, and we can put the expected environment as config dot get string, and we want to get our test underscore environment, right? And then maybe we can just put a log info statement here to print our environment, and we could say expected environment is brackets and expected environment, and we can also write an assert statement just to be sure that it is indeed the same environment as we expect. So if we give it as expected environment, and then we could say, yeah, in this case it's going to be the same thing, right? But we're also printing it out, so no surprises there. Get string expected environment, and this is going to be the message, right? So this is our test for the payment service. And how can we tag this test? So like, if you know that all these tests are for payment service, you can write a tag at the class level. You don't have to specify it at the application level, right? And even though you have smoke tests also, but these are like both smoke tests and also payment service tests, right? So let's call them as payment service. And you might ask, why not create like annotations for this like we did here? Because, well, creating annotations makes sense for things which are generic across the framework, like flaky test case, failing test case, smoke test case. But these are like just one-time usages, and then I don't think it makes sense to create custom annotations. But if you really want to do it, you can also do it. Like, there's nothing wrong with it, right? So let's also make a copy of this, and let's go to employee service and employee service, right? And in fact, copy the same test here. Let's put it here. Maybe in one we can put two test cases, and in one only one test case, right? That could be a good test to do. Okay, so the test for chosen environment runs, right? So now we have an upstream job which can trigger the test. We also have a downstream receiving workflow file, which can receive this trigger and which could run the test for the chosen environment and for the chosen tags which are passed from the upstream job, right? And we also have the test for each of those service. So we are basically all set. So let's just go ahead and commit these changes. So let's file open folder, and let's open 0, select folder, Let's go here. And guys, I can imagine this is a long video, but trust me, once you understand this, it'll be very easier for you to build, to deal with this situation. This is like a very important situation in any project to work with, and it adds a lot of value. So let's add this trigger workflow file, test employee service. Yeah, there are a lot of annotations that are not being used. We can clean them up. Okay, so let's add this test payment service, clean them up, clean them up. Okay, cool. Added both tests and trigger for external services, right? Services. Commit, git push. Okay, let's push the changes. Okay, let's open trigger test external event, create pull request. Okay, let's see the files that we changed. Trigger test manually. Yeah, I just renamed some of the files from, just to get a good readable names in the actions. But these are two changes that we have done on external event. We have added these test cases for employee service and payment service, right? So I'm going to just go ahead and merge the changes. Let's go here, and I'm going to squash and merge the changes, right? So now we have changed in the downstream job to basically run the needed test for the service. So let's just go ahead and go back to our employee service, and let's go back to employee service. Let's go back to our pull request. This pull request is created on the develop branch, right? So when we merge this pull request, it should trigger tests for develop branch for employee service, which should run in the zero repository. So let's also open GitHub for our zero repository. Zero, right? So this is our employee service. We have created a pull request on the develop branch. Let's go ahead and merge this. Let's look into the actions. It should trigger a workflow for develop. And in the zero repository, let's also open the actions tab. At this moment, we have nothing, which is good, right? Because there are no triggers anymore. In here, we've got a merge pull request from our PR on the develop branch, right? So now you can see it has sent a trigger, and now in a few seconds you can see now this deployment completed notification event was received, and now it has triggered test on a so I have to rename the branch. It's not on a schedule, it's on I have to rename the workflow file because it's not on a schedule, it's on a trigger test on a from an upstream job. So I have to rename this, but this is the branch that is being triggered, right? So now let's look into the run test. All the tests are run, and in the employee service, if you remember, we had two test cases, if I remember correct. Or was it one? Let's see. Zero. In employee service, we have one test case. Okay, so that's the one that we ran. In payment service, we had two test cases, right? So the interesting thing that we want to see is what was the name of the environment. So the name of the environment was the test employee service was run. So it did not run the payment service test. It did not run the test sandbox test. It only ran the test for the employee service, which is exactly is what we wanted, right? This is what we passed in our upstream job. So let's go back one more time. And I think now we're also coming closer to an end to our video, guys, but just want to like be 100% sure that so we are past develop environment, we are past employee service test, and that is exactly is what happened. It ran test employee service test, and the environment was developed, which is what it logged, and only one test. So let's go ahead and do something else as well. In our employee service, in a Git flow branch kind of setup, typically once you are ready, you want to like push something to production, you also create a new pull request, which could be from a develop branch to a staging branch. So let's pick a develop branch, and from develop branch we want to create a pull request on staging, and now it should trigger a workflow on the staging branch. So let's create a pull request, and we could say develop ready to merge to staging, create pull request, and now it should trigger a workflow not on the develop branch but on the staging branch if everything is fine. So let's see. It triggered nothing because probably the workflow is not yet available in the staging branch. Yeah, it has to be on the merge on staging branch, not on the pull request. So I first have to merge this, and then it will trigger the workflow in the staging branch. So let's go back to actions, and now you can see the staging trigger is now started. And let's go back. 0 to 1 jobs completed, and this time it should pass the test environment as staging and not develop. So if we come here, let's scroll down, and so we passed the environment as staging. The tag was employee service, and this time we expect the test to run on the staging environment, right? So again, the workflow was triggered, and the name is wrong, guys. So I will just immediately after this, I will rename and fix it. So test with Maven, and if you look here, same test employee service test was run, and this time the environment was staging. So I hope with this it's like super clear, like how you can run dynamically your test on different test environments, different services. If I go back and revisit this pane picture, like in this case, we saw that on changes on develop or on merges, on deployment, on development, on deployment, on staging, we were able to run our test on one microservice. But if you pick the strategy as matrix strategy, which is what we have done, and if you provide the name of different repositories, it will trigger tests on all these repositories like how you want. And the same can be done like from different microservices. So let's just go ahead and quickly fix the last error that we have, and that is git branch, git checkout main, git pull. I just rename our files, and on an external event, trigger test on an external event. So let's just rename this, Control C, and everything else is good, right? So let's create a new branch, git checkout branch, fix typos. Let's open VS Code. Okay, fix typos, fixed typos, commit, git push, publish branch. Okay, and let's go back to 0. Let's create a pull request, fix typos, create pull request, and I'm going to merge this, squash merge. Cool. And this time let's just trigger the pull let's just trigger this workflows like manually, because we also added a workflow dispatch event. So if I click on this, trigger test, why does it not show? Oh, this is employee service. So we can run the workflow, right? So let's trigger it from develop branch, and let's just run the workflow. And this time, like, I just want to see the proper message. So let's see, trigger test. 0 to 1 job completed. Okay, so this is done, and let's go back to actions. So we expect to get a trigger on develop branch from develop branch. So now this is good. Deployment completed notification event, right? And trigger test on an external event, because earlier it was the typo was, the name was wrong. And if we come here, and I also renamed this because earlier it was like run test on external event and run test. So now I've separated it, like one is to trigger test and the reusable workflow is running test, right? So one is a trigger, second is a run, and we have our expected desired result here. So it became a very long video, guys, but I expected this to be a long video because, as you can see, we have to set up like an upstream repository. We have to set up workflow files there. We have to set up workflow files in our own test repositories. We have to write some tests to demonstrate. So it became a little bit longer video. But once you understand like how to do this with GitHub Actions, if you're using GitHub Actions, then you can just simply replicate this. But if you're using even other CI solutions, the concept remains the same. So I hope with this you will learn how to trigger your tests which are in a separate repository than your microservices, to get a very quick feedback immediately after something is merged into a develop branch or a staging branch. If in your company they insist to run it on a pull request, that can also be done. The only thing that you would need to do is you have to pass on those base URLs also as a part of your payload. Like here we were only passing the test environment and the name of the test, but then you would also need to pass on the base URLs. And if you pass on the base URLs, and if let's say your environment is built using the rest of other stable branches. So let's say if you want to run tests on a PR on develop branch, your DevOps team can actually build the infrastructure for all the other microservices on develop branch using the changes on the PR branch from that particular microservice. So like if you want to run tests on a PR on this, your DevOps team can build the develop version of all these other microservices using the code of change on the PR, pass the base URL to your test, and then everything else will work fine. The same can be done for staging. Like only the changes go here, and the rest of the application can be built using the stable branches. But as you can see, like in this case, we are sort of doing a cross mapping, which is like an anti-pattern. Not many people like it, and it will create a huge amount of infrastructure workload load on your systems. So I think this is a good compromise to run your test immediately after something is merged into a developer staging branch. And this way we are shifting left, getting a quick feedback to our developers on what is broken so that they can fix it in like as soon as possible. So I hope you learn something interesting in this video, something useful in this video, which you can also replicate in your own projects. All the code is available in my repositories. Like you can find this repository as a public repository. Same goes for this, and like feel free to replicate and use it in your project. Now, if you like this video, well, please press the like button. If you want to subscribe to my channel, you can. I'll be happy to see you there. And maybe in the next video, what I can do is I would like to now tackle more about the collaboration side of things, because now we have worked more on the CI/CD side of things. Now I want to spend like 2 or 3 videos on saying how we can collaborate together with other people in terms of pull requests, in terms of having a common code formatting tool, and then probably I would deal another interesting topic about monitoring and alerting, right? So thanks for hanging with me. Like if you watched the video so far, like I appreciate it. Thanks for watching the video, and I look forward to see you guys in the next video. Thank you. See you. Bye-bye.